A major conviction in Nigeria's criminal justice system is now under serious legal threat. The Attorney General of the Federation has taken the case to the Supreme Court, not to argue emotions, politics, or public sentiment, but to question whether the conviction was lawful at all. At the center of this appeal is a disturbing claim that the trial court relied on a law that no longer existed at the time judgment was delivered. If that claim is correct, the consequences go far beyond one individual case. It raises questions about jurisdiction, constitutional compliance, and the validity of criminal convictions across the system. This appeal is not about guilt or innocence. It is about whether a Nigerian court can lawfully convict and detain someone under a repealed statute. So the key question we need to examine is this: what happens when a conviction is founded on a law that was already dead, and what does that mean for the rule of law in Nigeria? The Attorney General of the Federation has filed an appeal before the Supreme Court of Nigeria, challenging the legality of the conviction of Nnamdi Kanu. According to the appeal, the Attorney General is asking the Supreme Court to examine whether the law was correctly applied by the trial court that delivered the conviction. The appeal specifically challenges the judgment delivered by Justice James Omotosho, arguing that the conviction was based on a statute that had already been repealed at the time the judgment was delivered. The Attorney General states that a conviction founded on a repealed law is legally defective and cannot stand. He relies on provisions of the 1999 Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, as amended, particularly Section 36 subsection 12, which provides that no person shall be convicted unless the offense and penalty are defined in an existing written law. The appeal also references Section 36 subsection 8, which prohibits punishment for acts that were not offenses at the time they were committed. The Attorney General argues that once a law is repealed, it becomes legally inoperative and cannot be revived by judicial interpretation or prosecutorial argument. On this basis, the appeal asks the Supreme Court to determine whether the trial court had the jurisdiction to convict under a law that was no longer in force. These are the core issues formally presented to the Supreme Court in the appeal. This appeal is being raised at a critical stage of the case. The conviction in question has already been delivered, and the defendant remains in custody. Ordinarily, appeals focus on evidence, procedure, or sentencing. However, this appeal focuses on something more fundamental: the legal foundation of the conviction itself. The Attorney General is raising this issue now because questions of jurisdiction can be raised at any stage of proceedings, including at the Supreme Court. Once it becomes clear that a conviction may have been founded on a repealed statute, the issue cannot be ignored or deferred. The timing also reflects the Attorney General's constitutional responsibility to ensure that prosecutions are conducted according to existing law, not merely to defend convictions after the fact. In legal terms, when a jurisdictional defect is identified, delay only deepens the consequences. That is why this issue is now before the Supreme Court, rather than being treated as a routine appeal point. The real issue in this appeal is not procedural error or technical oversight, it is jurisdiction. In criminal law, jurisdiction is the foundation of every valid trial. A court must not only have authority over the person and subject matter, but must also apply a law that is in force at the time of judgment. The Attorney General's argument is that once a statute has been repealed, it becomes legally non-existent. A court cannot rely on it to define an offense or impose punishment. If a conviction is based on such a law, the problem is not how the trial was conducted. The problem is that the court acted without legal authority. This is why the appeal emphasizes that the defect goes to the root of the case. Without jurisdiction, the entire proceeding is void, regardless of evidence or intent. In simple terms, the appeal argues that a conviction cannot stand if the law supporting it had already ceased to exist. This appeal affects more than the individual at the center of the conviction. First, it directly affects the criminal justice system. If a conviction can be sustained on a repealed law, it undermines the certainty and predictability of criminal prosecutions nationwide. Second, it affects trial courts and prosecutors. Courts are bound by the same laws they enforce, and prosecutors have a duty to ensure that charges and statutes relied upon are valid at the time of trial and judgment. Third, it affects persons currently in detention. If convictions based on invalid legal foundations are allowed to stand, it raises concerns about the legality of continued detention in similar cases. There is also a broader impact on public confidence in the rule of law. The legitimacy of the justice system depends on strict adherence to constitutional requirements, not outcomes alone. Finally, it affects the office of the Attorney General itself. The appeal reinforces the principle that the duty of the Attorney General is not only to secure convictions, but to uphold the Constitution and ensure justice according to law. While the appeal clearly challenges the legal basis of the conviction, there are important issues that remain unresolved. The appeal does not yet explain how a repealed law came to be applied at such a late stage of the proceedings. Whether this was an oversight, a misunderstanding, or a deeper systemic failure has not been publicly addressed. There is also limited clarity on internal safeguards within the prosecution and the court system. At what point should the repeal of a statute have been identified, and who bears responsibility for ensuring that only valid laws are applied? Another unanswered question concerns precedent. If the Supreme Court agrees that the conviction is void, it may open the door to similar challenges in other cases where outdated statutes were relied upon. Finally, the appeal does not fully address accountability mechanisms. Nullifying a conviction may correct the legal error, but it does not automatically prevent the same mistake from recurring. These gaps matter because they determine whether this appeal leads to broader reform or remains a one-off correction. For ordinary Nigerians, this appeal goes beyond one high-profile conviction. It speaks to a basic expectation that no one should lose their liberty unless the law clearly allows it. If courts can convict under laws that are no longer in force, then legal certainty is weakened. People can no longer be confident that the rules governing criminal responsibility are stable and predictable. This issue also affects trust in the justice system. Citizens expect courts to apply the law as it exists, not as it once was. For those currently facing trial or serving sentences, the appeal raises concerns about whether similar legal errors may exist in other cases. In simple terms, this case reminds Nigerians that constitutional protections are not abstract ideas. They are practical safeguards meant to protect everyone from unlawful punishment. As this appeal moves before the Supreme Court, there are a few key developments Nigerians should pay attention to. The first is how the Supreme Court frames the issue. If the court treats the use of a repealed law as a jurisdictional defect, the implications will extend far beyond this single case. The second is the court's position on continued detention. If a conviction is found to be legally void, the question of whether detention can continue becomes critical. Another thing to watch is institutional response. Whether prosecutors and courts introduce clearer safeguards to prevent reliance on repealed laws will show if lessons are being learned. Finally, attention should be paid to accountability. If the court orders further inquiry into how this error occurred, it could signal a stronger push toward systemic correction rather than isolated fixes. These developments will determine whether this appeal marks a turning point in how strictly constitutional safeguards are enforced. This appeal places the spotlight on a fundamental principle of justice, that no conviction can stand unless it is grounded in valid, existing law. The Supreme Court is not being asked to decide guilt or innocence. It is being asked to decide whether the legal process itself remained within constitutional boundaries. If the court agrees that a repealed law was applied, the implications will go beyond this case, reinforcing the idea that the rule of law must prevail over outcomes. At the heart of this issue is a simple but powerful question. Can the justice system correct itself when a foundational legal error is identified? How the Supreme Court answers that question will shape public confidence in Nigeria's constitutional order going forward.